The wind whistled through the deserted Karoo landscape as a lone car sped down the empty stretch of Route 60 to near Uniondale. It was close to midnight, and the only light was the pale glow of the moon, casting eerie shadows over the flat, dry plains. The silence was heavy, pressing against the car windows, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of a far-off bird. Inside the car, Robert tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had been driving for hours, exhausted but determined to reach his destination by dawn. His radio had long given out, and with no signal on his phone, he was left alone with his thoughts and the growing unease settling in his chest. As he rounded a bend, something caught his eye, a figure on the roadside. His heart skipped a beat. There, standing on the shoulder, was a young woman. She wore a flowing white dress that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were fixed on him as though she had been waiting. Robert hesitated but felt an almost magnetic pull to stop the car. He wasn't normally the type to pick up strangers, especially on such an isolated road, but there was something about her that he couldn't ignore. She looked lost, vulnerable, and somehow familiar in a way that he couldn't explain. He rolled down the window and leaned over. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman nodded, but didn't speak. Instead, she simply raised her hand, motioning for the passenger door. Without thinking, he reached over and unlocked it, watching as she climbed in, her movements slow and deliberate. As she settled into the seat beside him, the air grew noticeably colder, sending a shiver down his spine. He tried to speak again, but the words seemed to die in his throat. She looked straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes blank and unblinking. A strange, floral scent filled the car, delicate and out of place in the barren landscape. Robert forced himself to focus on the road, but the silence was oppressive, heavy with unspoken words. Every so often, he stole glances at her, feeling a strange, irrational fear begin to settle in his chest. She didn't blink or move, and her stillness was unnatural, as though she were not quite alive. After what felt like an eternity, Robert managed to break the silence. "Where are you heading?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. Instead, she turned slowly to face him, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight, empty and cold. I'm going home," she murmured at last, her voice a distant echo. Her words sent a chill down Robert's spine, but he tried to play it off with a forced smile. "All right. Home, it is," he replied, hoping she'd say something more. But she turned her gaze back to the road, her face an unreadable mask, and the silence fell between them once more, as thick as the fog gathering outside the window. The car's headlights pierced through the dense fog as they drove on. Robert's mind raced, filling with uneasy questions. Who was she? What was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere, in that strange old-fashioned dress? But every time he opened his mouth to ask, something held him back, a quiet, instinctual fear. As they continued, the cold in the car grew more intense, and Robert could see his breath fogging up in front of him. He glanced at her once more, noticing that while he was shivering, she didn't seem affected at all. She sat as still as a statue, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, with an expression that looked almost sorrowful. Unable to shake the fear, Robert finally whispered, Are you okay?" For a moment, she remained silent, and then her lips moved, barely forming the words. "They never stopped looking for me." Her voice was like a distant echo, and her eyes seemed to fill with a quiet, unending sadness. Robert's blood ran cold as her words hung in the air. He swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel even tighter. Who never stopped looking?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer, but a single tear slid down her cheek, catching the faint light from outside before vanishing into the darkness. As they neared the outskirts of Uniondale, a strange feeling washed over Robert, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The woman began humming softly, a tune that was familiar yet hauntingly sad. It sent chills down his spine, making his hair stand on end. The melody was beautiful but laced with sorrow, as though she were singing to someone she'd never see again. Finally, as they approached the town, the fog lifted slightly, and Robert saw the lights of Uniondale in the distance. He felt a surge of relief, but when he looked over to tell her they were close, the passenger seat was empty. His heart dropped, and he quickly pulled over, staring at the vacant seat in disbelief. She was gone. He stepped out of the car, scanning the road behind him, but there was no sign of her. The night was eerily quiet, as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet, deep down, he knew he'd just encountered something beyond the realm of the living, a lost soul searching for peace on an endless road.